Hello, this is Mike Simpson. Welcome to part 2 of Going Under the Hood of Jboss.
The unauthorized reproduction or distribution of this copyrighted work is illegal. Criminal copyright infringement, including infringement without monetary gain, is investigated by the FBI and is punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison and a fine of $250,000.
In this presentation, we're going to continue looking under the hood of Jboss and going into some detail as to how Jboss is going to work. If you have any questions or comments regarding the content covered in this presentation, please use the question and comment box located below. Okay, let's get started. Here are the different topics we're going to be covering during this presentation. We're going to be looking at some of the different configuration issues that you might encounter during configuring Jboss. We're going to be looking at some of the different core services that you might encounter in Jboss. We're going to look at how we do logging of information in Jboss, and we're going to look at security in Jboss. Now, in terms of logging Jboss, Jboss deals with a lot of information, and so you're going to want to look at Jboss's log files, not just to see what's going right in Jboss, but if you have a problem with Jboss, you want to look at the log files to find out how to debug any problems that might occur. You'll also want to look at the core services for Jboss to deal with security issues. Now, we mentioned that logging and security were core services for Jboss, but you'll also want to look at some additional services that might be encountered. We also mentioned that Jboss supports web containers, and so you want to look and see what the application server web container is there. Now, the default application server web container for Jboss is Apache Tomcat, but you might want to have another application server web container. We're going to discuss Tomcat as the Jboss application server web container, but the same things that we talk about for Tomcat will be applicable to other application server web containers. It's possible to swap that out. We'll conclude with a discussion of the 2 exercises that accompany this module. The first exercise will be that of performing a basic configuration of Jboss, and the second exercise will be that of exploring web server containers in Jboss. We'll start with a discussion of basic configuration issues within Jboss. First thing we'll take a look at are the core services that we might encounter. Now, core services for Jboss include items like writing out information to Jboss through its log files. Now, the basic log technique that Jboss uses is the log technique called log4j. Some of you may have encountered log4j with other Java logging technologies. There's a basic logging technology called log4j that came from the Apache project, and most Java programs use log4j as a logging configuration. And so that's one of the logging techniques that's used. So we're going to deal with that, and then we're going to deal with how security is managed. These basic services, such as logging and security, are specified in the jboss-service.xml file, and that's specified in the configuration directory. So let's take a look at a piece of that file. First logging, and then security. Now also, the Java naming and directory interchange, or JNDI, is also specified out of that file, as well as JNDI view. Here's an example of what that chunk of code looks like. We're going to look first at the JNDI view service, but that's also a part of the core services. Now, the chunk of code that we see up at the top of the slide refers to a managed bean. You can see the mbean tag up at the top, and that mbean tag has a line that says code equals org.jboss.naming.jndi view, which means that we're going to pull in that managed bean. And then the name of that managed bean is Jboss being service equals JNDI view. And so what that chunk of code says is that we're going to pull in the managed bean. The class for that managed bean is the JNDI view class, and then the name of that managed bean is going to be a Jboss service JNDI view. So the JNDI view service is going to be handled by the bean whose source code comes from the JNDI view class. So that's going to be one of the core services that's available. Now, what about Jboss logging? Well, as we said earlier, Jboss uses the Apache log4j technique for logging, and that Jboss Apache log4j technique defines appenders, and appenders are groupings of logging levels, logging formats, and logging destinations. And appenders basically say we're going to append data to a particular log file, and that data is going to be appended at a particular level, it's going to be appended in a particular way, and it's going to be appended to a particular destination or location. This configuration is going to be specified using a log4j.xml file, and that log4j.xml file sits in the configuration or conf directory. Let's take a look at a configuration example so that we can see how that works. Again, this is coming out of that log4j.xml file. In this case, we're going to limit information that comes out of org.jboss. So we're going to say that the category org.jboss, so any information that comes out of that is going to be in the Jboss category, org.jboss, will be limited to info. So we're going to only log info entries as opposed to debug information or error information or warning information. So the different priorities that are there allow us to categorize what level of information we want to see. So we could see info information, we could see debug information, we could see warning information. Those are the different types of categories. Now, just to give you kind of a heads up, if you change that level to be something like debug or warning or all, you're going to see an awful lot of information. So you want to exercise some restraint in making the priority value to be something like all or debug, because you really don't want to do that unless you A, want to see lots and lots of log information, and B, are going to change it back really quickly. The default behavior is to log all this information to a file whose name is server.log, logged in the same directory. And the additional behavior is that a new server.log file will be generated on a daily basis, so that normally turns over every 24 hours. Older log files will be date stamped, so the server.log file, once it turns over, the previous log file will be date stamped, so you'll always know what server.log file you're looking at. To illustrate the way in which you can configure the log files, let's take a look at how we can use our logging information to redirect some of this output. Now, we're going to redirect the output that's going to occur from container managed persistence. Now, I don't want to get distracted from the concept of container managed persistence, but let's just, for the moment, say that container managed persistence occurs when Jboss saves information that's been changed and it's going to be saved back to the database. So we've changed some information and Jboss recognizes it's got to be saved back to the database. So we're going to log the fact that Jboss is saving stuff back to the database. So we have an appender here. The name is CMP for Container Managed Persistence. The class is org.jboss.logging.appender.rollingFileAppender. Now that's all supposed to be all on one line. It's really not supposed to be broken here just because of the slide. then error handler space class equals org.jboss.logging.util.only-once error handler. In other words, we want the error handler to only occur once. Then the parameter name is the file. Then the value is Jboss server home directory /log/cmp.log. So the file where we're logging this stuff is going to be to the Jboss server home directory /log/cmp.log. So that's where we're going to log this stuff. Parameter name is append, value is false, so we're not going to append stuff. The parameter is the maximum file size is 500K, and the parameter name is maximum backup index, value is 1. So when we are going to be writing stuff out, we want to write information, any output from container managed persistence, out to this CMP log file, which we are arbitrarily designating to go into the Jboss server home directory /log/cmp.log, and write it out to this file. Maximum file size is 500K, and don't append the data. Now we are arbitrarily defining the name of the file and the maximum file size and all that sort of stuff. So it's up to us to define these appenders. So you can see that we have some flexibility here. Continuing with our redirection example, we can also specify that as part of our redirection, we can also specify a pattern for the way in which our data appears. As part of the layout of our data, we can specify that the data to appear should appear in a particular pattern. So we can specify that the pattern layout should be org.apache.log4j.pattern layout. That's the class that we're going to use. And then the parameter name of a conversion pattern specifies here's the way in which the data should appear. And then the value is the date and then minus 5p, %c, and then the month and the date. So that's the way in which the data should appear. That's the pattern layout. And then here's the category. So for the plugins for the container managed persistence, and then the priority value is debug, which is a debugging level. And then here's the appender reference, which goes back to that container managed persistence. That links back to that. So this provides the pattern matching value for the way in which we're going to write out the data that's going to go out for the container managed persistence. So there's the conversion pattern for our data. And then so here's the layout, and then here's the data that should be written out. So the category of name for CMP, so any data that should be written out like that, write it out at the debug level, because presumably we're writing stuff out at that level. Write it out using the CMP pattern, which is the pattern that was there, and then write it out using that pattern level. Now let's take a look at Jboss Security. Now, Jboss Security is managed by the login-config.xml file, because when a user logs into a Jboss application, that user can be prompted with a login and password file. And that login and password file can then be used to essentially authenticate the user to the system. And then based upon that authentication of the user to the system, the user can say, okay, well, the user can be authenticated at a particular level. Are they a regular end user? Are they a manager? Are they a supervisor? What have you? And then based upon that, we can put the user into one or another security domain. Once the user gets put into a security domain, we can then use Java Authentication and Authorization Service, or JAAS, to be authenticated and placed into a particular security domain. And Jboss works with Java Authentication and Authorization Services to be placed into the appropriate area. The appropriate domains get specified in the application's Jboss deployment descriptors. And the deployment descriptors can be found either in jboss.xml or for the web side, jboss-web.xml. So we'll take a look at these two deployment descriptors as well as login-config.xml to look at the appropriate domains. So we said earlier that the security domains and the login domains were core services for JBoss. There are some additional services that are considered non-core services, and these non-core services are hot deployable services. Hot deployable services mean that they can be added and removed without having to restart JBoss. These non-core or hot deployable services are found in the deployment directory. And these services include a standardized web container, now with the ability to serve and receive web pages, Java Messaging Services, or JMS, an embedded database. The default embedded database is HSQL, Hypersonic SQL, Java Mail, and JBoss System Properties, and Transaction Management. Now, these services can be added and removed and configured without having to restart JBoss. So we can configure our system for a relatively small footprint if we're running on a system that's kind of tight on memory. We can take these out, which is nice. Or if we want to have a full-blown system, then we can add in all these bells and whistles. So that's part of the flexibility of JBoss, is that we can add and remove these as needed. JBoss uses Apache Tomcat as its default web container. It's a lightweight, low-resource default web container. Works perfectly fine for serving web pages. Many people have used Apache Tomcat. It's very well known, very secure, very easy to configure, has lots of advantages. It's handled through JBoss web-tomcat.sar, system archive file in the deployment directory. Basically, look for that file in the deploy directory, and that's basically a self-contained version of Tomcat. So what that means is when you install JBoss, simply look for that file in the deployment directory, and if you've got that, then you really don't need to be running a second version of Tomcat because you've got Tomcat already there. You configure that embedded version of Tomcat using the web.xml file in the deployment directory. Now, the Tomcat configuration directly is done using jboss-service.xml, and there are a series of attributes in jboss-service.xml. You'll see attribute name equals configuration, then values for the attribute, and then an end attribute. So in order to configure Tomcat, you can go into the jboss-service.xml file and use appropriate attributes there to configure the embedded version of Tomcat. Now, when JBoss is managing Tomcat's behavior, which it will do if you're using the embedded version of Tomcat that's embedded within JBoss, then logging output from Tomcat will go to the JBoss log directory, which makes sense because JBoss is managing the Tomcat behavior. Logging output from Tomcat goes through JBoss's logging scheme, which means the output from Tomcat is going to go through the JBoss log directory. It's not going to go through Tomcat's normal log scheme. So what that means is that if you want to deploy an application within Tomcat, you put the application in JBoss's deployment directory, because what you're really doing is deploying it within JBoss. So you put it in JBoss's deployment directory. So just hot deploy it, copy it into the deployment directory, and it automatically appears. Pretty straightforward. That brings us to the end of this particular presentation, and we now have not one, but two exercises for you, or one exercise divided into two parts, depending upon how you want to look at it. First part is performing basic configuration of Jboss. You've already downloaded and unpacked Jboss, and if you haven't, please do so. We're presuming that you've done that. So now the first part is to do a basic configuration of Jboss. We'd like for you to start Jboss up with your standard configuration. So you start up Jboss with your standard configuration and see how that works. Then we want you to create a second configuration, a custom configuration of Jboss that requires no logging. In other words, take the logging out of Jboss and then restart Jboss with the no logging configuration. And look at the various startup messages that ensue when you have Jboss with a no logging configuration, and compare what you see with the no logging configuration as opposed to what you saw when you had Jboss in the standard configuration. The idea of this part of the exercise is to see what happens when you create a custom configuration as opposed to what you see when you start Jboss with a standard configuration. So that's part one. Now, in part two, we want you to take a look at exploring web server containers in Jboss. Now, we said earlier that by default, your web server container was Tomcat. So we want you to go back and start Jboss up using the default web container, which was the embedded version of Tomcat. Then, what we want you to do is to create a custom configuration. And in the custom configuration, we want you to replace Tomcat with an alternative web server container. So, for example, given that the default web server container is embedded Tomcat, replace it with something else. Replace it with Geronimo, replace it with some other web server, and then see what the difference is. And then restart Jboss with your custom configuration. And then review the logging output when you replace it with your custom configuration. If you have questions with regards to any of the content covered during this presentation, please use the question and comment box located below. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you found this presentation both interesting and useful.